I'm a bit overwhelmed by all of this. I appreciate the honor very much. I want to emphasize that I think that the kind of work that I've been doing is exactly the kind of thing that all of us deal with all the time. I've simply implemented the things that I've learned through the American Society of Mammalogists. And of course, I've not done this by myself by any means. I want to begin by recognizing my primary collaborators on the project, Danilo Balete and Rickart. They have been heavily involved in this for a long, long time. I need to mention that there are a great many other people who've been involved in this as well. I don't have time to list all of them, but here's a list of some of the institutions that have participated in a variety of ways over the years, some of the funding sources and so on. I need to mention also that Sharon Jansa and Scott Steppen, who are here today, have been very heavily involved in some aspects of this. I also want to thank a couple of the people who are here today who went way above and beyond the call of any reasonable duty in encouraging me along the way. Richard Thorington and Tom McIntyre in particular have done a great deal to help form my interests and make opportunities available. Okay, so we're going to the far side of the world today. This is my image of the Philippines, the things that I think about. The Philippines is an archipelago that lies off essentially to the east of Vietnam. It's a tropical country. The total area of the Philippines is about 300,000 square kilometers. That's about, I think, 3 times the size of Cuba in total. The habitat is fabulous. The animals are wonderful. This is mossy forest in the lower left-hand corner. I know this is hard to see. This is a habitat that occurs at the high elevations in the mountains there. Rainfall typically averages about 5 meters per year, and there are places that receive up to 8 meters of rain per year on average, and there are some years when there is more. Fabulous habitat. The vegetation is dominated actually by trees that we just heard about. Oaks are particularly abundant in this habitat. The animals are absolutely fabulous. I'll tell you more about those as we go along. This project has been very heavily field-oriented. A lot of time in the field, both collecting data and running training programs for people in the Philippines. Okay, some basic factoids, just to give you the context. It's probably an unfamiliar place for most of you. As I mentioned, the area is a little over 300,000 square kilometers, so not a terribly large area. It's about the size of the state of Arizona. It is the largest oceanic archipelago right now by some definitions, and of course there are various qualifications for all of that, but it is overwhelmingly an oceanic set of islands. No land bridge connections to the Asian continent anywhere except for one very limited portion of the Philippines. There are about 7,000 islands. 700 of them are large enough to have permanent human habitation. It is an area of exceptionally high geological activity. There are volcanoes scattered all over the archipelago with major eruptions that take place periodically. There are small earthquakes that take place very, very frequently. They tend not to have terribly large ones most of the time. It is an area where typhoons sweep through frequently. There are up to 33 tropical storms, so not necessarily a full typhoon, but major tropical depression that enter into some portion of the Philippines every year. A direct hit for a typhoon can drop as much as 1 meter per day in some of the mountainous areas. The Philippines has one of the highest concentrations of non-volant endemic mammals. So there are other parts of the world that challenge that, of course, but overall it's remarkably high. There are at least 210 species of mammals that are native to the Philippines. As I'll talk about in a few minutes, the rate of discovery remains remarkably high. There probably are at least 250 species that are native to the country. And my guess is that when we finish sorting through all of the taxonomic, phylogenetic issues on these animals, something on the order of 80% of the species will be considered to be endemic, including the bats. One of the distinctive things about the Philippines is that there are a very, very large number of isolated areas of endemism, so localized areas of endemism. So unlike most parts of the world where areas of endemism tend to be several hundred thousand square kilometers or millions of square kilometers. In the Philippines, as I'll show you, some of these areas of endemism are only, well, less than 100 square kilometers, and some of them probably less than 50 square kilometers. So very, very localized patterns of diversity. When I started working in the Philippines, my first trip in 1981, there were about 42 million citizens. Today, there are over 105 million people in an area the size of Arizona. It's one of the most densely populated countries in the world. Not surprisingly, associated with that, it is one of the most heavily deforested countries in the world. 500 years ago, virtually the entire country was covered by some form of tropical forest. The number of different kinds of vegetational formations. That is now, by various estimates, down to probably 6, maybe 8% of the old growth, perhaps as little as 4% of the original old growth forest. So the Philippines is sometimes listed as the most heavily deforested tropical country in the world. So when you combine these various elements, I think that you can all see that there are immediately going to be major challenges for maintaining some sufficient level of conservation of habitats and species. Now, I'm going to talk about just some examples. There's obviously not enough time to go through the entire mammal fauna. And in particular, I have to apologize, although I love working with bats, I'm not going to talk much about them today. It's mostly going to be using examples having to do with the Philippine murids. And for much of that, I will emphasize the island of Luzon, which is the largest island in the Philippines where Manila is located. A lot of these are just outstanding animals. The photograph of me in that first slide, that critter that I was holding, is a giant bushy-tailed cloud rat. This is the animal that's on the left-hand side of the screen here, Crateromys schadenbergi. The head and body length of that animal is about like that. The tail is about that, so the animal is about that long. Absolutely gorgeous animal. They live up in that very high elevation mossy forest in areas that get 4 or 5 meters of rain per day. If you take a spritzer bottle and squirt water at one of these things, the water just beads up and runs off the outside of the animal. The rain and fog can be very, very heavy, and clearly the animal inside its fur is staying dry. The nose and the feet get wet, and the rest of it is dry. This group of animals collectively are referred to as cloud rats because they live in a cloud forest, that mossy forest that's shown in the upper right-hand side there. A diverse group. These are basal murids, or basal murines anyway. So one of the earlier branches to branch off from the primary Asian group. They vary greatly in body size. The biggest of them, Phlomes pallidus, weigh up to about 2.7 kilos, so that's medium, small house cat size in terms of the weight. And they range down in size to that animal, which is Musaromys gulantang. This is an animal that, Danny caught the first one in 2004. They weigh about 15 grams. So these are all members of an endemic radiation. that is centered on Luzon and restricted entirely to the Philippines. These are all arboreal folivores. The biggest ones eat somewhat rough vegetation, bamboo shoots and that kind of thing. And as you go progressively smaller and smaller, they shift to more and more fruit and seeds. Another one of the groups that's very diverse, one of our favorite ones to work with, are the ones that we now call earthworm mice. We called them that because we realized early on that we were having a great deal of trouble catching these things. We, one day, quite some time ago, happened to catch one of these guys in the middle, Kameez saurocoides, or actually Kameez saurogensis, alive. At that point, we had only the vaguest idea of what they might eat. Caught the animal in a live trap that we had pushed into the side of a bank where there was the exit from a burrow. The animal couldn't get out without going into the trap. Brought the trap with the animal back to camp, kept it alive for a couple days, feeding it different kinds of things, doing feeding trials. We tried seeds, not interested. We tried beetles, not interested. Snails, nope. Cooked rice, dried mangoes, anything we could think of, it wasn't interested. At some point, one of the guys, after having the animal in camp for a day or so, one of the guys kicked over a rock next to the little table where the cage was, and picked up an earthworm from underneath the rock, held it out to the cage. This little animal leapt across the cage, grabbed it away from him, sunk its teeth in one, and shucked off the dirt and swallowed it whole. These are primary vermivores. As you go up in elevation in the Philippines, of course, temperature declines, rainfall increases, soil conditions change. As you go up in elevation, the density and abundance of earthworms increases dramatically. It's a huge resource that is used heavily by this endemic radiation of mammals. They feed, of course, some of them more widely on other soft-bodied soil invertebrates, and these guys down here, the ones that look the most like mice, Kameez, often feed on a variety of seeds and fruit and such things, but they prefer earthworms in general, respond very, very positively to them. These are diverse and abundant animals. We recognize 5 genera, again, all part of an endemic radiation. Up to 7 and possibly 8 of these occurring syntopically, all feeding on earthworms in different parts of the environment. Crotomies, in the bottom corner here, are burrowers, going down into the soil layers after earthworms. Archboldemies and Sericomes are animals that live in the leaf litter, foraging again for earthworms and soft-bodied soil invertebrates. Rhynchomees are animals that look to me rather like a very long-snouted version of a kangaroo rat hopping around on their hind legs. They maintain little trails through the tropical forest, the mossy forest, patrolling day and night for earthworms. Apomees actually includes a couple of species that forage for earthworms up in the trees. There are so many epiphytes in this forest that there are little pockets of soil up there that maintain earthworms, and they hunt for them up there. Now, these animals, as I mentioned, are members of endemic clades, and I think this pointer is a little hard to see, but upper left-hand corner there is the phylogeny for the cloud rats, and our best estimate of the actual chronology of their differentiation. So these are animals that arrived in the Philippines, we think, about 14 million years ago. During that time, they have diversified into now 5 genera, all of which occur syntopically. So the process of diversification, which we think probably primarily initially involves allopatric speciation, has resulted in not only development of additional diversity allopatrically, but there has been now development of secondary sympatry, so that the communities of animals, of these mammals that occur in these areas, particularly the cloud forest, includes principally members of just these 2 clades. Up to 6 species of cloud rats and up to 7 and possibly 8 species of the earthworm mice occurring syntopically. So these are communities of animals that are made up of about 90% of the species are members of these two clades. They have evolved, if there is such a thing as a co-evolved community of mammals, fully co-evolved, this is it. Okay, so 18 species of cloud rats that we recognize now, 12 of them on Luzon. There probably are additional ones that we haven't encountered yet. Roughly 1.4 million species, 1.4 million species per million years. With the earthworm mice, we recognize now, we think about 56 species, 36 of those on Luzon. They arrived in the Philippines only about 7 or 8 million years ago. That yields an overall rate on Luzon of 7.4 species per million years. These are considered to be pretty high rates of differentiation. So this has been a process of progressive morphological and phylogenetic diversification that has gone on in this region over the course of about the last 14 million years. Now, this is a map of the Philippines that shows both the outlines of the modern islands, that's the dark green, the surrounding seas in blue, and the areas of islands as they existed during the periods of Pleistocene sea level lowering. As I'm sure you're familiar, well, where I live in Chicago, 12 to 20,000 years ago, there were a couple kilometers of ice. As that ice formed, due to changes in subtle shifts in the Earth's orbit around the sun. As those sheets of ice formed, of course, water was evaporating from the world's oceans, being deposited on land as snow, and gradually building up. So as the glaciers built up, sea level went down. The net change in the last 4 major glacial cycles was about 120 meters. So we can get a reasonable estimate of the extent of dry land during those periods of low sea level, 120 meters below the present level, simply by drawing a line around the edge of the islands at that bathymetric level. And what we see is that here in the north, Luzon, Manila Bay is right there. Luzon remained as a separate island, separated from the northern extent of Greater Mindanao by a channel that remained open but was only about 10 or 15 kilometers wide. Mindoro Island here remained isolated. Another set of islands here that merged together but remained isolated from surrounding ones. And then various other islands scattered around the archipelago that experienced some level of merging with adjacent islands. So all of the islands here on the eastern side remained as purely oceanic islands. The islands that made up Greater Palawan may have merged into the Sunda Shelf, the continental areas here north of Borneo, which was part of the continent at various times, may have merged up here. If it didn't, it was very, very close. Certainly, the Palawan mammal fauna today is largely one that is closely related to Borneo, not to the rest of the Philippines. So each one of these islands remained isolated. If we look at them today, what we see is that among the non-flying native mammals on Luzon, at least 95% of the species are endemic to Luzon. The other islands are not as well known. Some of them are also quite a bit smaller. So probably Greater Mindanao is very, very similar. There's a lot more work that needs to be done down there. Some of the smaller islands, like Subduction, for example, it looks as though it may only be 4 or 5 out of the 8 native non-flying mammals, but still a relatively high level of endemism. So one of the reasons why the Philippines has such high levels of endemism and diversity is that it is actually made up of a large number of separate biogeographic regions, areas with separate histories, separate areas of endemism. Now, in addition to that, there's another deeper layer of complexity. This is a map of Luzon Island, and that's outlined here in black. showing outlined in green the separate areas of geological activity on the island. Luzon is actually an amalgamation now of at least 10 separate islands. 10 islands that had separate geological origins at different points over the course of the last approximately 30 million years. The oldest and now highest mountain range is the Central Cordillera of northern Luzon. It originated by about 27 million years ago. Some of the other areas are much, much more recent. The next oldest is this area here, the Zambales Mountains, about 18 million years ago. There's an island down here that began to form by about 6.5 million years ago. Others that are, well, here's one that's only 2.3 million years old, 1.2. Notice that right here in, well, not quite in the middle, but at a critical point, there's an area that only uplifted about 500,000 years ago. So the island of Luzon as we see it today is actually something that has been produced relatively recently, and it has been produced predominantly during the same period of time that the evolution of these mammals has taken place. So they have evolved in a geologically dynamic theater, and one that has been changing constantly over the course of that roughly 30 million years. Now, one of the crucial aspects of that, let me go back again for just a moment. The Philippines is not entirely literally volcanic in origin, but largely so. It's being formed principally by subduction of the Philippine ocean plate underneath the ocean plate that forms, and I'm simplifying, the edge of the Asian continental shelf area. Major area of subduction. Every century, there are 9 meters of Pacific Ocean plate that disappears down underneath the Philippines. Every century, 9 meters of ocean floor that's about 10 kilometers thick and it's several hundred kilometers long. That's a tremendous amount of material that's being subducted. As that material is subducted, of course, it gradually is heated. It's very rich in water because it's been below ocean level. The water becomes part of the mixture because its specific density is lower than that of a lot of the other materials. The portion that contains the water is lighter, and of course, in this somewhat liquid mass, it rises to the surface gradually. When it reaches the surface, the effect is similar to what happens when you pop the top off a Coke bottle. You get bubbles forming. You know, that releases the pressure. Well, it's a little more dramatic than that. You get Mount Pinatubo or another major volcanic eruption. So that's the primary origin of the island. Of course, now that's taking place over a very long period of time. The volcanoes erupt in various different places, but there tend to be centers of geological volcanic activity over periods of time. So we get these islands forming of different ages and gradually filling in. Now, to put this into a bit more of a perspective, this area right here that began forming about 7 million years ago includes a number of different volcanic vents. One of those, not the largest, is the Mount Pinatubo vent. You may remember that in 1991, I believe, Mount Pinatubo erupted. It was the second largest eruption of the last century. The largest was a volcano in Alaska that caused much less trouble and got a lot less attention. The eruption of Mount Pinatubo produced, I believe the figure is about 10 or 12 cubic kilometers of volcanic ash. The vent of Mount Pinatubo that was erupting at that point, that was simply one of many eruptions that began about 35,000 years ago. The total amount of volcanic ash that is estimated to have been erupted from the Mount Pinatubo vent over the 35,000 years is in excess of 200 cubic kilometers. The amount of material that's being produced is enormous and has enormous impact then on the landform, the amount of land, and the kind of habitat that is available to these organisms. This is a volcanic landscape. It's the environment in which these animals have evolved. And that, I think, becomes a very important point later in some of the issues that we'll talk about. Okay, so these are volcanoes. Volcanoes, of course, build up into cones. These are the traditional, Mount Fuji type volcanic cones that build up into a nice high peak. At a mature state, they may reach an elevation typically of about 2,500 meters, unless they're starting at a higher level. If they're erupting from a base that has built up over millions of years of 1,000 meters, then they'll go that much higher. But they'll typically build up to about 2,500 meters. Now, that is important because the Philippines is a very, very rugged country. The mountains are not terribly high. The highest are only about 3,000 meters. So by global standards, not terribly high, but it is topographically quite rugged. Here's a diagram that shows the primary different habitat types along that 3,000 meter elevational gradient. Lowland forest, the typical tropical lowland forest in appearance, in this case dominated by trees of the family Dipterocarpaceae, which are marketed usually as Philippine mahogany. That goes up to 800 to 1,000 meters. At that point, you transition relatively rapidly into a montane forest type of habitat, dominated by oaks, laurels, myrtles, the kinds of things that I think of as being northeastern US type vegetation. And as you go up higher and higher, it gets cooler and wetter, and you get more and more of the predominance and conspicuous predominance of epiphytes on trees. So tremendous numbers of different kinds of mosses, orchids, lots of things growing up on the trees themselves. As you go up in elevation, rainfall increases in a very steady way. In the lowlands, the average is about 2 meters per year. Of course, the lapse rate around the world is pretty much the same everywhere, depending on the humidity of the air. In the Philippines, the standard lapse rate is about 6 degrees centigrade per 1,000 meters. So very regular decrease in temperature as you go up in elevation. Of course, as the air cools, it's able to retain less moisture. So condensation begins to take place, and rainfall increases. So as you go up in elevation, temperatures cool, rainfall increases. Up to a certain point with the rainfall, and at that point, in a sense, the clouds begin to go around the mountains, and so rainfall sometimes begins to drop back off again. So these are the primary different habitat types. Now, this brings us to something that has been a major change, or represents a major change in attitude, certainly since I began graduate school. I initially learned that maximum diversity of virtually all groups of organisms is in lowland tropical rainforest. Well, among mammals, certainly that's true for bats. So here on the left-hand side is just one example. These are bats of the family Hippocideridae, insectivorous bats, very common, rather diverse in the lowlands. The diagram, the dot diagram in the upper left-hand corner, simply shows you that the majority of the species in this family, the records are from elevations below 1,000 meters. There are a couple of species that get up a little bit above that, one that goes up rarely somewhat higher. Clearly, this family of bats and all of the other families of bats in the Philippines are predominantly diverse in the lowlands. That's where they're diverse, that's where they're abundant. That's not true, though, for many other groups of mammals. So the pattern that's emerging, and I'm sure this is familiar to many of you, as you go up in elevation in most places, the diversity of those animals and abundance increases as you go up in elevation. typically up to somewhere perhaps around 2,000 meters or so, and then it begins to drop off a little bit. This is very clearly the case for these endemic radiations of murid rodents in the Philippines. So some photographs of what some of these animals look like on the bottom. The top diagram is about half of the species on Luzon of this group of earthworm mice. As you can see, there are only a couple of species that occur in the lowlands. They're fairly common down there. But there really are only a few species that are present at all below 1,000 meters. Predominantly, these are montane animals. And as you go up in elevation, as you can see there, there's an increase in diversity up to about 2,000 meters. And I'll show you a little more detail about that. And then we begin to see that tailing off taking place up there. So the image then that I need for you to have in your minds is of a topographically diverse area, geologically dynamic, with mountains being produced rather frequently, scattered around the archipelago, with lots of isolated populations up high. This is why the level of endemism is so high, and this is very strongly associated with the diversification that has gone on. This provides a tremendous amount of opportunity for allopatric speciation. Now, when we began to recognize this pattern, somewhat belatedly, we began an intensive series of studies focused on Luzon Island, beginning in 2000, to document the distribution and abundance of mammals on Luzon Island as a case study. We sampled in nearly all of these, all of the isolated highland areas present on Luzon Island. Over the course of the 12 years of this, there were about 37 team months of field work that went into this. Danny Balete was the team leader for the great majority of the field work that has gone on. The result of this was we expected to find a few new species, but even more than we expected. When we started this project, the number of native non-volant species of mammals on Luzon was 28. We are still working through some of the specimens that we have. The total is certainly now well over 60. We have more than doubled the number of species of mammals known on the island, the non-flying mammals. This included two new genera. These are examples of some of the species that we found. These are very, very diverse animals. They're not simply more of the same of something we already knew about. A remarkable, some of that, but in general, remarkable diversity. One of our favorite discoveries is the one that's shown on the left here. This is Mussaromes, the one I mentioned earlier. This is a spectacular animal. When Danny caught it, first brought it back into camp, we spent a great deal of time looking at it, never seen anything like this before. This is an animal, that's my hand. It weighs about 15 grams, so a tiny little mouse, kind of a golden orange color. The whiskers are so long that they reach down to the ankles. There's an area of bare skin posterior to the eye where there's a second set of whiskers that arise that are essentially the normal length of whiskers. The whiskers that typically are vibrissae that come off of the wrist of most rodents that are usually quite small on these guys are quite elongated. Very long tail with hair out at the tip. A hind foot that has considerable resemblance to my hand. These are animals that live up in the treetops. They're up running around on the vines and small branches through the trees in mossy forest. My image, these are animals that we've just discovered. We now know of 4 species that are distributed about different parts of Luzon. My image of these animals is that probably they're out foraging at night at times when it is, when it's foggy, it is dark up there. There is virtually no light at all available. They're finding their way around almost exclusively by sensory perception using their whiskers, I suspect. So the number of species, and I use this as a warning to those people who like to try to extrapolate how many species there be on the basis of overall levels of increase in numbers of species that are known. Here's a graph that begins in 1880 when very few species on Luzon were known. By 1900, we were up to, I think, 18. If you were to draw a regression line through there, you would expect that today we'd know about 30 species of mammals on Luzon, and instead we know of at least 60 that are there. These figures are very, very heavily dependent on the intensity of field work and the quality of the field work that has been done, the quality of the inventory work that's been done. There's a skill set involved in doing this kind of work that is often not sufficiently appreciated. Okay, so some things that have come out of this. Of this approximately 60 species of small mammals on Luzon, 76% of them occur only within a single area of endemism. These areas of endemism are shown on this map. They correspond to those geologically independent islands that have developed over the course of the history of what we now call Luzon. You'll see that in the upper left-hand corner, the largest and highest and oldest part of the island, the Central Cordillera, has the largest number of endemics. There are 15 species that occur only within that area, and by and large, so far as we can tell, are fairly widespread within that region. Of the other areas, the maximum number of species that are endemic, that are known currently, is 5. And they vary greatly in size. Some of these areas, and again, I worry that you may not be able to see this, but anyway, down here and over here, 5 endemic species of mammals in areas that are certainly less than 100 square kilometers. That, I think, is more endemic land mammals than there are in any continental area of any European country. And there are multiples of these within a single island, which is approximately the same area as Indiana. So the number of endemic species is high, and the localized endemism is extremely high. Now, not surprisingly, when we plot out on the top graph up here, the number of native small mammals versus the elevation of the peak of any one of these areas, there's a very tight correlation. As you go up in elevation, as the mountains get higher and higher, you pack more species in along that elevational gradient. So of course, there's a correlation, strong correlation, between the maximum height of the mountain and the number of species of native small mammals that occur there. The same is true if we look at not the total number of native small mammals, but down here on the bottom, the number of local endemics that occur within each of those individual mountain ranges. Now, ideally, this is, it's a significant correlation. It looks pretty good. It's unfortunate that we don't have a bunch of mountain ranges that have elevations in this range. That would be extremely helpful. Unfortunately, we have to work with what we have. The correlation certainly seems to be a consistent one. It makes sense. So, endemism is associated with geographic features on a very, very regular basis. By the end of this project, we had reached the point that before we went to a previously unsurveyed mountain range, we could say not only how many species would occur on that mountain range, but how many of them would be endemic species. So it's a very, very predictable, regular pattern. All right, so that's the biogeographic background for this, and I've moved through that fairly quickly. And I'll now turn to dealing with some of the conservation issues. This is the image that we would like to have of the Philippines. This is what we would all like it to look like. Unfortunately, there are other aspects to this. And I actually don't want to dwell on this for too long. There has been a tremendous amount of deforestation. The population growth of humans is very strongly correlated with that. The result is flooding and erosion that does tremendous damage. Remarkably, at this point, we do not yet know with any certainty that any of the Philippine mammals have become extinct as a result of this. It seems as though, with one possible exception now, that all of them are still hanging on. Some of them barely, but it's not yet too late. The extent of forestation has been tremendous. Here are some maps that show deforestation on Luzon beginning in 1875. And remember that virtually the entire island was covered by forest at one time. 1960, 1998, it has progressed since then. The worst case scenario is Mount Dada National Park, originally 5,500 hectares. It's now down to 88 hectares of natural habitat. The rest of it has been converted into commercial vegetable farms. Okay, not all of the news is bad though. This is a graph that shows for that most species-rich, diverse area up in the central Cordillera of northern Luzon, a list of the species that occur, small mammals on the left. All of them except the last two are native species. The last two, Rattus exulans and Rattus tanazumi, are exotic pest rats. What this shows is a couple of very interesting things. One is that these pest rats, which predominate in deforested agricultural areas, don't invade into intact old-growth forest, nor do they invade into nicely regenerated disturbed forest. They are strongly associated with areas of strong human disturbance. The native species, on the other hand, occur widely across this entire spectrum. And actually, what we have found is that the native species do better at invading into anthropogenic habitats than the exotic species do at invading into natural habitats. And when forest is allowed to regenerate, the native species move back in and the exotic species disappear. This is not the conventional view of the way we might expect this to work. And it's a very, very important finding in a number of respects, obviously. Now, one of the things that we have learned is that when we discover new species and make an announcement of this, people absolutely love this. Finding out that there's something that occurs in your backyard that doesn't live anywhere else in the world is something that a tremendous number of people respond to very positively. Not everyone, but a lot of people really do care. This kind of basic biodiversity research is something that can have a very positive impact. The result of our findings in that respect has been to just generally heighten public awareness in the Philippines of the unique biodiversity that's there. We've also worked fairly closely with the government agencies that are responsible for dealing with national parks and wildlife, and have been greatly surprised and very pleased with the response that we get. Now, we're all aware of the complexity of the situations that we're dealing with. We have learned that when we make these discoveries, often we learn that there are other people who live in the area who are very much concerned about protecting their watersheds. In the Philippines, that makes perfect sense. What we do is provide a spark, and we provide the basic scientific data that are accepted by essentially everyone as being reliable information, solid information that they can use. One of the outcomes of this has been that when we recommend that various areas be designated as a national park or some other protected area, the response often is to say, yes, that's a good idea. Please give us all of your information and we'll work on it. So there are a substantial number of national parks then that have been have been positively affected by this. We are not responsible for this solely, certainly, but it has been a way of contributing to the process of promoting the development of the national park system. One of the things that has really helped is, I suspect many of you know, the Convention of Biodiversity that has been now signed by most nations worldwide obligates countries to set aside about 17% of their land area as protected land. That's an important thing to keep in mind anytime you're working in any similar country. They are now, there's no legal enforcement. There's no penalty to be paid if they don't do this, but it's something that they have essentially committed themselves to do. So they are looking for information about the best places to put these protected areas that they have now promised they will designate. This makes this a very, very good time to be doing this kind of work in a lot of countries, and that's certainly been a factor for us here. So the names of the parks on the left and the numbers of endemic mammals in each one of these parks, and this is number of newly discovered and previously known species in each of these parks. So the number of species of mammals that have been given some level of legal protection now is pretty high. The last thing that I want to mention is that there have been major changes taking place in the Philippines. The rate of population growth in the Philippines traditionally has been the highest in Asia, obviously. From the time I started with 42 million people now to 105 million Philippine citizens. However, although things have at times looked rather grim, there are major changes that have taken place in the economy. The biggest one is that now approximately 12 to 15 million Filipinos are working abroad. That's about 25% of the workforce is working abroad. That has happened in the last 20, 25 years for the most part. It has had huge impact on the economy because virtually all of those people send money home. They send remittances home. That goes into often rather poor families. What those families do then is build a nice big house in an area that otherwise has been quite poor. They're setting that up as a place to go home when they retire. One of the effects of this is that the birth rate has plummeted. It's still the highest in Asia, but it's half of what it was 20 years ago. These are things that we can have absolutely no impact on. We simply need to be ready to take advantage of them when they come along. The result of this is that the amount of second growth forest in quite a number of the places where we have worked is increasing. And that's the habitat that we now know many of the native species of mammals can move into as it regenerates. So, in some respects, limited respects, there are a number of things that are actually getting better at this time. One of the very best things that's taken place has been an increase in the number of Filipino biologists who are interested in these matters. In 1992, with a grant that we got from the MacArthur Foundation, we gathered up all of the Philippine terrestrial vertebrate biologists who we could find. There were 26. We had a symposium, decided to organize a new society called the Wildlife Conservation Society of the Philippines. It meets annually. The ASM meetings are the model. Currently, the meetings attract about, well, the last one in April had about 300 people who attended. There are about 800 members now. That is certainly one of the most important things that any of us can possibly do. Doing the things that we enjoy, working with especially our younger colleagues, encouraging them, helping to create opportunities, providing training, and simply developing much more of a sense of community. I think I'm out of time. I think I should stop there. Thank you all.